Good afternoon. My name is Melissa Dietrich, Associate Director of Membership, and I'd like to welcome you to a Winter Gardens Beauty. Today's recorded presentation and plant guide will be emailed to all attendees. It is my great pleasure to introduce our presenter, Amy Bloom, Senior Horticulturist who manages the Hillside Garden, Conifer Knoll, and Frog Hollow areas. Amy has been with us for 4 years, and previously she managed the March Bank at Winterthur Museum for 12 years. Longwood's Hillside Garden is one of the best places to visit in the winter because of the structure, the texture, and the mix of evergreens. At the end of the presentation, Amy can answer questions about creating winter interest in your garden. You may submit your question via chat. Amy, thank you for being with us today to share your love of creating gardens with winter interest.
Hi, everybody. I am really excited to be here because I am pretty excited about winter gardening. It is one of my favorite seasons, believe it or not. Winter is sometimes an underappreciated season, and to me, it is a season filled with quiet moments and rest and a sense of rejuvenation and excitement for the next season to come. I think the quote that I have here kind of sums up my just the beauty of winter. I love to see the landscape erupt in life in the early spring or see little glimpses of flowers throughout the winter. The best part are scents. Nothing beats winter blooms and colors. For me, I seem to pay attention to the light and the shadows and get excited by what snow can do to a landscape. You can't tell me that the winter landscape isn't captivating after a snowfall. I could go on and on about how beautiful the winter landscape is, but it is also an important time for gardeners. You may think that there's nothing to do, it's too cold, it's too dreary or wet, or things are just too frozen. But there is plenty to do in the winter, and we sure do find a lot of things to get done. But I must admit that a lot of things are done indoors as well. Most of the time at home, I'm looking out my window or watching the birds or dreaming what my garden will look like or be like, and what I will be doing in the garden in just a few months. I oftentimes spend a lot of time reading books and magazines, finding inspiration, learning about what new plants are being offered at nurseries and catalogs. I do a lot of prep, a lot of designing, and a lot of plant orders. But on mild days, when it's about 35 degrees, that's when we run outside and we get as much sunshine or work done or anything that we can do when it feels just a slightly bit warmer. There is plenty of things to clean up and things to prune. I just want to mention though that the winter is a great time to take a moment and observe, and it will help you improve your overall garden throughout many seasons. So I'd like to take the next moment and talk a little bit about designing a winter garden. I think that a lot of people have questions about design, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this. I think designing can feel a little bit overwhelming. To me, it's one of my favorite things to do. I do have a degree in environmental design, so I really enjoy it. It means that I can be engaged in what's happening in the garden during all seasons when I feel like I'm designing an area. And I'd like to help you with this process and give you some suggestions to help you feel that designing a winter garden or any garden won't feel so overwhelming. So in the winter, this is the best time to do some of these things, and start reflecting on the past year of gardening. What did you like or not like in your garden? Write this all down, start a garden journal. You can do this while you're wrapped in a blanket on the couch. You can do this while you're sipping a cup of coffee. eating cookies or pie or enjoying the winter, take some time to plan and design, take some measurements, take photos in the winter. Sometimes you notice more in a photo. A wintertime photo will make the bones of your garden really stand out. And this photo, this slide is a perfect example. You can see the contrast against the snow, and you can see the bones of your garden. Start a garden journal. Start with your needs, your wants, your desires for all the seasons, and in the wintertime especially. Add tasks you performed, and add inspiration. I love to add inspiration because it's really fun to look at beautiful gardens. Use magazines, Pinterest books, and photos of gardens you visited. Ask yourself, what style of garden do you like? What kind of winter garden do you want to see at your house? And then just set some easy goals and strategies. Start small, work on one small area, move on to the next. Start with a container, start with a patio or a porch or somewhere that you go to often, or a spot that you sit at often. And then lastly, take a little bit of time to walk around the garden and think about views from a window, views from a porch, views from wherever you may sit. Or for me, it's doing dishes. I look out that window every single day, so I'm going to improve what I look at out there. Ask yourself questions to start the process, like, do you watch the birds feed? Is there something you want to hide in the winter? What's your favorite colors? What don't you like about that spot over there? Or is your garden sunny or shady? This will help narrow down your needs if you're feeling overwhelmed. Narrow this down to what you want to see in the winter. Do you want to see evergreens in that corner? Do you need to fix that fence? It's much easier to do some repair work in the winter than it is in the summer when things are covered in plants. One example is, I need to add more evergreens to my woodland garden. In the wintertime, it's bare and there's not enough texture or color. So I know that that's what I need to do for my garden. And I'll probably make notes, and I'll start my list of plants that I can buy at the nursery when it opens up in the spring. So some great and little words that can help you with designing are just thinking about these 4 elements: structure, texture, color, and evergreen. If you can add all 4 of these, you'll have a dynamic garden. You can see on the left, that's the hillside. You can see the light hitting the grasses and the blue sky and the color, the contrast against the snow. A winter garden is like designing in any season. You want to consider these 4 things. The only difference is that winter exposes the stark bones of your garden. So that's the important base that you want to build on. Without leaves on the trees and shrubs, the structure of your garden is the most noticeable. So the winter time is the perfect time, like I said, to take photos and to notice what you may need for other seasons. Tiny details are noticed and appreciated in the winter. So add those, play with them. Structure is really anything permanent, such as trees and paths, fences, and stone walls. They add detail as well. Outbuildings. And thinking about the structure can really help you in a design. Like, for example, a path can lead your eye through a landscape or through your garden to a certain direction or a focal point. It could lead you away from a less valuable area, or you may notice your trash can a little bit more in the winter, but if you create a focal point on the other side of your garden, you won't notice that as much. There are areas where your eye will pause. Trees and shrubs can create architectural elements of interest. I think that's the best part about using trees, is they're beautiful in the winter. They can be twisted or have some kind of interesting form. And they will be obvious if you take a black and white photo. Texture, another element, is a garden made solely of evergreens is plain, but adding texture and complexity will instantly transform the composition of the garden. The texture is used in the hillside is used by the grasses. And this can be done with the addition of a few grasses to contrast against the solid green. Adding texture by leaving attractive seed heads from perennials can add depth and excitement. Some great advice I once heard was use texture in the winter as you would use color in the summer. All plants dry in different shades or colors, and in planting in the natural garden by Piet Odorf, he will actually give you structural plants, a list that you can go and use if you're ever interested in adding some structural textural elements to your garden. So there's lots of resources out there to help you figure out what colors some of the texture may be from grasses and such. Color in the garden. Color in the garden in the winter is mainly just earthy and mainly gradations of color: brown, green, yellow, red, white, purple, and black. So it's really fun to play with those colors. And sometimes you can add a little bit of a pop of yellow and it gets exciting in the landscape. So it's a little spark of life, especially when you see a snowdrop or forsythia or winter jasmine bloom. It's a welcome sight to maybe a gloomy summer day. So think about adding some of those pops of color. Color mainly comes from flowers or a berry or a dried perennial or variegated leaves from plants. Last is evergreen. When contemplating plants for the winter garden, the first thing that comes to mind is evergreens. Evergreens are important because once you decide on your evergreen elements, you add your deciduous trees and build from there. Next to your perennials, you can see that they fill in voids and spaces. But the green gives you a fresh kind of vibrancy to the landscape. And they're also important for wildlife. So it is they're a nice windbreak for wildlife. An evergreen comes from a shrub or a tree. It can be from a perennial. It can be weeping or conical or pyramidal. It can be in groups, planted in groups. It can be great for hiding unsightly objects or forming a focal point. Use with texture to create a dynamic garden. Actually, right now, if you walk the flower garden walk right now, it's usually planted, prepared for a bulb display. So it is 2 borders of pretty much brown soil, but this year they added some Ilex crenata to the beds, and you can see the little green, little bits of green in there have really elevated that garden. So now that we touched on design, I thought we could talk a little bit about plants because that's the fun part. These next slides are some of my favorite winter plants, some trees, shrubs, and then perennials and bulbs. The best part is that all these plants can be found in the hillside. So if you are coming back to Longwood, you will find all these plants in the garden. And you can see them at other times of the year. You can see what they look like in the summer and see what their fall color may be. I just want to say there are a lot of plants out there that are beautiful in the winter. There's a lot. It's really hard as a horticulturist to narrow them down to just 20. So please don't think that the ones that you love or the ones that I may not have mentioned are not worthy. They just didn't make it on my list. I tried to put a diverse group of plants on here that could appeal to you, being you're a person who loves native plants, maybe suffers from deer pressure or looking for a plant for a sunny or shady location, or maybe introduce you to a new plant that you didn't know about. Before we start, I'd like to mention, I will briefly touch on each plant and the details, but there is a resource guide provided to you that has a little bit more of the zones and some detail that might help you with your garden. So we're going to start with the first tree, and you may be familiar with this. It's Acer griseum. It's a paper bark maple. I mean, you can't beat the exfoliating bark and the reddish copper color. It's a small tree, so it's the perfect tree for a small garden. It's just an absolutely easy, beautiful plant to grow. The exfoliating bark doesn't cause any and does not cause any kind of messiness on the ground, and there's no disease problem. So it's just a beautiful winter silhouette and a plant for any garden. The next plant is Betula nigra. It's a river birch. And we at Longwood have a variety called Heritage. Heritage is a variety that you see a lot. It's a very easy birch to grow. It's because it is heat tolerant, it grows fast, it's beautiful exfoliating bark. Most of the time you see it multi-stemmed. Here at Longwood, ours is single stem because it is quite old. But it is a really easy plant to grow. Has beautiful fall color, and it is native. The next one is Cornus moss, and this is a really beautiful tree that isn't used as much or seen as much. It has an amazing yellow flower in March when nothing much is going, no trees are really flowering too much. So this is a beautiful bright color. And there's a lot of cultivars coming out right now that are making the flowers a little bit bigger and brighter. You can see that it does have red berries in the summer. And it's just a nice small tree / shrub. So it's great to use with winter aconite and galanthus as well, or snowdrops. The next plant is Chimonanthus praecox, so it's called winter sweet, and this plant isn't seen, I don't think, as much, but it is another fantastic plant to use. It flowers before the leaves, so you get these highly scented yellow flowers. If you want to see this tree right now blooming, it is blooming on the hillside at the moment. Sometimes it has a little bit of a dark center, but a really fun, highly scented flower and plant to use in the garden. So we're going to look at some shrubs next. And shrubs kind of make up the middle ground and also an important layer to the winter garden. The first one is Buxus sempervirens derunc, and you'll see this in the meadow part of the hillside. They're kind of used as a pyramidal element that kind of contrasts against the wildness of the meadow. They can be conical or pyramidal or upright, whatever shape you want them to be. It has a naturally vertical habit. So it is evergreen, so it is a nice evergreen element and deer resistant. You do want to prune this in February, March, and be leery of boxwood blight, but that just means that you should sanitize your tools, give a good air circulation. But this plant is also great for containers. Use it as a focal point or an accent. It has a really great architectural element to it. Aucuba japonica. This is a great plant too because it can take shade, and what a great pop of color in the shade. You get the variegation. There's lots of cultivars. Aucuba japonica that comes in other white and green, different types of variegation. I just bought one that's plain green. And it's amazing that this is a great little plant for shade or part shade. I wouldn't put it in full sun. It does get a little bit burnt, but it really is easy to grow. It is not deer proof, so we do have to cage this plant if you're in an area that has some deer pressure, but it definitely brightens up the winter garden. This can also easily be used in containers. And I mean, how can you not have a winter garden without Ilex verticillata? There's lots of cultivars of Ilex as well. I just chose winter red. because it is on the hillside. Ilex is just so versatile. If you have a wet area or a hard little area that's difficult or stays moist, Ilex verticillata will be happy there. It's pest free. You will have to think about getting a male pollinator for about 9 to 10 females. So you do have to figure out what your male pollinator will be for whatever Ilex you have. For example, Ilex verticillata winter red needs a pollinator, Apollo or Southern Gentleman. So that is something to think about, but it's used for Christmas decoration. You can see it's used in a container. It comes in orange berries. It's just a fantastic plant. Sarcococa is another really great plant. This is on the hillside, and it just can't be beat in the spring to smell Sarcococa. And there are so many visitors that come through the hillside, and the whole hillside smells like daffodils and spring and happiness, and it comes from Sarcococa. You wouldn't believe it because the flowers are so tiny, and it blooms at a time when things are still very wintry. So it's hard to believe that something so sweetly scented is blooming at that time. But it is another plant that is evergreen and takes part shade to full shade. So it does grow slow, but another fantastic plant. Calocarpa, there's lots of Calocarpa species out there. So so there's different colors of Calocarpa, different color berries. So it depends on what your interest is. But the hillside has two different types of Calocarpa. And the purple berries, you just can't be beat. They're just so bright. They flower in the summer and just continue to keep going throughout the fall. There's no pest problems, full sun. There is native varieties. It's best to prune them all the way to the ground to get the berries and the flowers. And there is just a little bit, one warning is they can be slightly invasive. So just if you can't manage some spots, just know that they can spread a little bit. Hydrangea paniculata. So that is such a great plant. There's so many different cultivars. You can get them for containers. They can be small, they can be green, they can be yellow or pink and red. They have such amazing winter interest with the dried seed heads in this slide. So they really do make a statement in the landscape. Full sun, they're drought tolerant, they're dependable and tough. And they just give you great texture in the winter. We oftentimes will cut the flower heads, and I'm sure if you've been here for Christmas, Longwood Christmas, you'll definitely see these flower heads dried and in Christmas displays. The next is hydrangea arborescens, very similar. It just has a different hydrangea, different flower head shape. So this also comes in a lot of different cultivars. This is a native hydrangea. So if you have a native garden, this is a fantastic hydrangea. It also gives you beautiful winter dried flower heads. This is one of my favorite plants. It can take part shade, some full shade. You can also cut this down to the ground if you'd like. There's different cultivars that give you really, really large flower heads, or now there's new ones with kind of pink coloring. Edgeworthia is another fantastic winter plant. The hillside has a lot of these, so definitely come back and see these blooming. These are native to China. They bloom early. They'll start in February and kind of continue on till April-ish, early April. They're very, very highly scented and a really fun and interesting plant to grow. But this one is deciduous, but you can see how lush and green the foliage looks in the summer. So this is a fantastic plant to grow. Camellia Northern Exposure is, if you haven't seen this on the hillside, it's just beautiful. It blooms in November when everything is kind of done flowering, and you'll see this plant in its full glory. Like I said, it blooms in November, and depending on the weather, it will bloom all the way into January. Camellias have really glossy evergreen leaves, so you have that evergreen element as well. And this one is about 4 to 10 feet tall, so it's about, a smaller tree. And it can be used in containers. There's lots of camellias, so this one may be a little bit more difficult to find, but I'm sure you'll find something that you like if you grow a camellia. Rhododendron maximum, I put this one in there because this is a beautiful staple in the landscape, especially if you're from Pennsylvania. You will see this growing naturally in the woodlands. And so this would be a native evergreen element. I'd love to add this to my woodland garden. It blooms in June, so you also have that element. This comes in many different cultivars as well if you want a brighter bloom or a smaller in height. But this is a beautiful plant as well, especially if you're a native plant lover. Next, we're going to touch on perennials. And perennials are some of my favorite because you can get so many textures and colors and variegation through perennials. The first one I'm going to talk about is upside down fern because it's one of my favorite ferns. It is so persistent and can tolerate our winters. It is not native, but has such a beautiful texture and lasts so long in the winter landscape that it should be used a little bit more. It holds up to extreme drought and dry conditions, so that it's making it through a lot of nasty summers here. It got its name because the leaf flipped over kind of looks like a regular underside of a fern leaf, so it's highly, highly textured. It is clump forming, and definitely grow it in the shade. So any carex is something that you want to think about to put in a winter garden. There's so many carexes out there with different colors that they're the perfect addition to a winter garden. I just picked Evergold, and we have ice dance on the hillside. That's really easy to grow. This one gives you great variegation and color to brighten up, just brighten up a little corner or add interest to your winter garden. You can see it looks great in the snow, and just really, really easy to grow and an easy way to get color into a spot. Calamagrostis is an amazing grass. It is perfectly upright and narrow. It is beautiful in the landscape and in a sunny garden. It never flops, so it's a great grass to use. It's just always tall, narrow, upright. It's native. It tolerates moist soils. It's disease-free. It's just the perfect structure to a garden. And I think grasses are one of those elements that really stand out in a winter landscape, and are if you're trying to design for winter, it'll be the texture that you use. Andropogon broom sedge is a grass that you'll see on the left. That's you'll find in the meadow part of the hillside. It is extremely beautiful in the winter. It has this copper color that nothing else compares to. And it really shines in the winter garden. It has beautiful seed heads. It is native, and it can tolerate really extreme conditions. If you're looking for a grass that just is about 2 to 3 feet tall, and you just can't get anything to grow in a sunny, dry, rocky area, that's the plant for you. But it has great movement and texture. It's a really fun plant to grow. Hellebore Niger, all hellebores are a perfect addition to a winter garden. I put in Hellebore Niger thinking maybe it might be a plant that no one has heard of. It is blooming currently in the hillside, so definitely go out and check it out. It's one of those plants that you see blooming amongst the snow that gets you excited that there's actually something out there blooming. It blooms before snowdrops do, so really before anything else is blooming. This is a really, really great hellebore. It has a little bit different foliage than the others. You have to watch about cutting it back. It's a little bit different than Hellebore hybridus and orientalis. It doesn't come in the same colors, but the white is just a great addition for a winter garden. And I cannot not mention seed heads, how important they are for a winter landscape. Any seed heads. I added echinacea because it is so good for wildlife and birds. The seeds are needed, but really any perennial that you can leave up will be used by insects or birds. It has an amazing textural element, but you're also getting the bloom through the summer, the beautiful tall pink flowers. You can see that the seed heads are great contrast. They're dark. They contrast against the grasses that you may have in your winter garden. And it is native and can grow in full sun. Next are bulbs. Bulbs are my favorite, my specialty. So Aranthus is the first bulb. Winter aconite. This is a really great plant for naturalizing. It's a little yellow flower that blooms early in the spring, and most of the time you will see this in meadows or lawns. It blooms with the Crocus thomasinianus that you see in the foreground, and this is a really, really easy bulb to grow. If you put a few seed or you get a little bulblet and you put this in, it will easily take off and seed around. This is not native. Galanthus elwesii. There are lots of different snowdrops. I put Galanthus elwesii. It is one of the earliest blooming galanthus. It seems to have larger flowers and is really robust. So it is an easy snowdrop to grow for you. It is beautiful and will also bloom amongst the snow. It is just really brightens any winter landscape. There are lots of people addicted to all different galanthus varieties, so there's plenty out there to get excited about. There's doubles, so just start with elwesii and you'll be hooked. Crocus thomasinianus is another, it's a little bit different than the crocus that you might think of. This is a woodland crocus. So this one is really highly scented and blooms a little bit earlier than the crocus that you might think of. This is found in outside of the hillside in the grassy areas, and they really open up when the sun comes out. So you'll see them closed on cloudy days or overcast days, and they really shine when it's sunny. So it really is a treat in the spring when you're just starting to get excited for the next season to come. This will brighten your day for sure. And what the great part too is that all of the little bees and any kind of little insect that's out will be on these. So it's really exciting to see these. Winter wildlife. So I wanted to mention wildlife because the winter time is such a great time to think about wildlife. I mean, I spend a lot of time watching the birds or leaving your perennials up for the birds, cutting back perennials. You might want to think about only cutting some and leaving some. But really thinking about your garden as a palette for habitat, or creating habitat in your garden for wildlife and insects. And I mention insects a lot because birds need the insects also, as well as the seed heads. So leaving leaf litter for the insects is important, and also the hollow stems of the perennials. But the winter is a great time to add feeders and build bird boxes, and start thinking about what you can do for the birds. I have to mention deer. Deer is a topic that we get asked a lot about, and I know that a lot of people really suffer with deer pressure. So in the wintertime, it can be a hard time to manage deer because they seem to have a pattern, and picking up on a deer's pattern is important in the winter, because you will be able to see where they're walking through the snow. So you'll see their trail that they create in your yard. When you find that trail, it's easier for you to either treat those plants with a repellent or change their habit. So that means that you can fence in some of the plants that need protection, or use an electric fence or some kind of enclosure to help with those areas. We have great success with liquid fence, deer off, deer stopper. I've used them all. I highly recommend those to help with your problems. Sometimes you might just have such extreme deer pressure that you will have to enclose some areas of your garden. Or even if you use plants that aren't as susceptible to deer browse in a winter landscape, they will still hit them. So try liquid fence, and just do the best that you can, and kind of live with the critters in your area. I'd like to touch on winter maintenance. It's another topic that, as a horticulturist, there's lots to do in the winter. Not only are we prepping and creating designs and plant orders, but winter maintenance is a top priority. I'd like to mention deadheading invasive perennials. That's an important thing to do. If there are perennials that you have that you want to leave up for the winter, but try and deadhead the ones that may be invasive. For example, Aster tetericus is a slightly more aggressive aster. And if you want to leave that up, just remove some of the seed heads. Prune any dead from trees, shrubs, and vines. You will notice more dead in the winter, especially if it's an evergreen tree. But you will also see crossing branches in the wintertime. And that is a great time to kind of prune, open up the shape. We do a lot of pruning we'll prune our hydrangeas, all the hellebores by the end of the summer. In this picture below the tree, that's the red colored ground cover, that's all epimedium. So we need to cut that back by the end of the winter to let the flowers show, as well as the hellebores will get a little ratty. So we'll cut the foliage off of those and get them prepared for the show, the display of flowers. But we do a lot of maintenance in the fall to prepare for the winter. So mulch mowing leaves, mulch mowing areas, which means that you're push mowing the leaves, chopping them up, but leaving them in place. And that will add to the soil and create a better soil for your garden, but also give you the leaf mulch which is very important. We do that to prepare for the winter. When the wintertime, the ground is frozen and we can't do as much. We try and get a lot of that done ahead of time. You may need to protect semi-hardy shrubs, and that means figs or maybe shrubs that are close to the road that may get salt spray. Like I mentioned, pruning hydrangea flower heads in the late winter is something that takes a long time. And then in March, you'll see in that photo in the slide, we will cut back the meadow. We can take an easy way to do it is to take a push mower right through the meadow, and we'll push mow the whole meadow down. But lately we've been hand cutting with a group of volunteers, hand cutting the meadow down to keep the perennials intact for hibernating insects or nesting insects, and we'll put them on a pile so they can continue their cycle. So last time, I'm just going to leave you with some of my favorite websites and some resources, because everybody needs resources. There's so many amazing books, and so Winterland is a fantastic book to check out, and that's in our gift shop right now. But there's so many resources out there, and a lot of garden books mention the winter garden because it is such a beautiful, magical time in the garden, and really getting out there to enjoy that is just part of being a gardener. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I just walk outside and observe and reflect and look at what's happening out there, and just how exciting it is to know what's coming, and watching galanthus and snowdrops pop up. Plant vendors, we get lots and lots of questions about plant vendors, so please feel free to take advantage of some of the lists that I put together. So does anybody have any questions?
We actually have a handful of questions, Amy. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure.
So the first one, it's about camellias. Could you share a little bit about the environment that has deer pressure, and are camellias an option? Sure.
And like I mentioned, we get a lot of questions about deer, and some of them are a little hard to, so Longwood does not have a deer fence at all. So we definitely feel the pressure of deer. Like I said, I will spray with a repellent all summer long, and that's a good thing to do, because you're trying out the repellent. It means that if you start in the spring and the summer, you're kind of moving the deer away from your more valuable plants and starting to push them away from the garden, and maybe finding another source somewhere there, another feeding source somewhere else. So start early. I definitely do have issues with deer munching on camellias, and I will put individual cages on them. So that is unfortunately what you have to do. Some of the larger camellias, we have the northern exposure that I mentioned. That is a larger one. So the deer may rub on that, but they may nibble on it, but we have it in a location that they can't get to. So there's a fence above it, a walkway, and another fence. So you might want to think about locating a camellia in a spot that, maybe it's not as easy to get to.
Thank you. Diana has a question about, could you recommend a vibrant grass for partial shade?
I would do a carex, any carex cherokeensis, a vibrant grass, carex ice dance, that has a tendency to really take off. So any carex for part shade is your best bet. You can get a variegated that is yellow and green or white and green. There's also a plant called a chorus, ogon. That's a great plant for part shade as well, if you have a little bit of a wet area. So they're all evergreen.
When you were discussing the bulbs, you mentioned the word naturalization. Could you share a little bit more about what that means?
Sure. So naturalized bulbs mean that they just seed themselves. They cross-pollinate, and you don't have to have any kind of intervention. They naturalize on their own. And instead of forming clumps, they sort of form there's individual plants that look almost like they've grown themselves without you helping them. So I think naturalized bulbs are beautiful. I mean, really hard to do sometimes because you need to wait to mow your lawn. You need to wait until that foliage dies back a little bit. So many bulbs will naturalize. Glory of the Snow, Crocus thomasinianus that I mentioned, Aranthus, even Galanthus nivalis, which is another type of snowdrop. They will all naturalize.
Great. So another question about the bulbs that you featured today. When is the best time to plant them?
In the fall. So you want to, we just put our bulb order in now. So yeah.
So now is the time to put your bulb order.
We just put our bulb order in for next year.
Always thinking ahead.
Yeah, it's hard with bulbs because you're ordering them at a time where you don't really think, like, we will plant some now, and that's not really the time that they'll bloom. So kind of have to think the season ahead.
So now we have a few questions about pruning. So we'll take one shrub at a time. So the very first one is about camellias. Could you share any tips you may have about pruning camellias, or when to prune camellias? Someone asked. We're a little concerned about pruning them, I think, in the wintertime specifically. So
I mean, camellias sort of have a habit that you don't normally would prune. So unless you're trying to keep it short or into a smaller shape. I don't know when you would prune them. I wouldn't recommend pruning them unless they're really, really large. So it really depends on what you're trying to do with that plant as to when to prune. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily, you can prune a lot of things when they're dormant, so you could do that now. And there's a lot of, it really depends on what camellia you have, honestly. So there's camellias that bloom in the early spring. So really narrow down what camellia you have first. If it's a japonica, you saw that Northern Exposure blooms in the winter time. So that's a completely different camellia than what you may have. So start there, and then that will determine if and when you prune it.
Another pruning question about beauty berries, and when is the best time to prune that?
So we prune our beauty berries, which is another tricky question, because you need to determine which species your beauty berry is. So the common beauty berry, the purple berry that you saw in that slide, we would prune that one in March. So we will prune it down to about 6 inches. So that is probably your best bet. There are there are taller varieties of beauty berry, if you have that type, that are taller and more arching, that I would not prune down to 6 inches. So that's why it's always good to determine what plant you have first.
Great. And just a reminder to all of our attendees, this webinar which is recorded today, will be sent to you, as well as the plant resource guide. So as Amy mentioned, there's going to be additional details about each plant that she shared, as well as the vendors and the resource information. So don't worry, all of that will be sent to you as well. Another question in regards of crocuses, and when is the best time to visit Longwood about crocuses to see them?
So the slide showed Crocus thomasinianus, like I mentioned, that blooms in March. So that's a really early blooming crocus. So crocus, most crocuses will bloom after that, so about April. But crocuses are always early bloomers. So they will always be one of the earliest blooming bulbs to see.
Great. Carol had a question. So she has a small garden, about 10 by 18, and she was wondering any advice for incorporating your 4 design elements within a smaller space.
That's a great question. So those design elements can be used in containers, but also in a small garden. So I always like to mention that a dynamic container will also have those 4 elements. They'll have an evergreen element, which can be through cut branches or an evergreen tree that you add to the container. And then a grass or even pine cones or seed heads. Herbs are another one that you can keep in your container and add to. That will give you the texture. And then color can easily come from cut branches, from winterberry holly, or anything that gives you a little pop of color. The same goes for a small landscape or a small garden. Just think about having a little evergreen element somewhere, a small shrub, a small plant, a variegated plant of some kind. It can be anything that's evergreen. And then your texture comes from a grass or from a dead or dried perennial. That's all it takes. Texture is just so easy. It comes from anything that's kind of textural looking. Like I said, even a pine cone can count as your texture. So really any spent perennial would give you that texture in a small garden. It's just really diversifying your garden. So just having a little bit of little elements of each. So perennials, shrubs, trees, that will give you those 4 elements easily.
Wonderful. We had a question about the liquid fence, so the deer repellent. Is it okay to spray it on plants in the wintertime? They are concerned about damaging the plants and it freezing on the leaves.
Yes, so that's a good question too. So what you want to do with liquid fence or deer stopper is what the directions will usually say that you apply it in the fall. And so that will hold you through the winter. So most of the time you will only need to apply it at some point in the fall, and it will last about 3 months. So that's why it's good to start earlier in the spring, because you're kind of building up to that point and you're getting better protection. So in the fall, when it comes to the fall, you've kind of been doing that all year, or the deer have, like I said, have moved on. And so putting it in the fall, you will not have to put it on the plant in the winter.
Wonderful. We have another question about planting in the winter. Are you able to plant in the winter if the hole is pre-dug and you're able to break ground?
That's a good question too. I would not recommend planting in the winter, but you can get away with planting in the winter in the early part of the winter. If the ground is soft enough and you can get a shovel in the ground and it's maybe a mild part of the winter, it was pretty mild until, just not too long ago, you could have put a plant in the ground. I would have mulched it heavily, especially if it's a tree that would that would be beneficial. If it's a perennial, I wouldn't necessarily recommend planting that in the winter because you have the tendency of, or the problem of it possibly heaving. So if a perennial heaves out of the ground, then it's really difficult for you to move that plant, and it will easily, the roots will be affected and it will kill the plant because it being so cold and the lack of moisture from the frozen ground. So if it's a tree, you could do it. You could definitely do it.
Could you recommend a favorite herb that would provide winter interest for a garden?
Sure. I have lots of herbs growing at home in the wintertime. I recommend using a frost-proof container though. And the larger the container, kind of the better. You just don't want too large of a container. And lifting the container off of the ground with some kind of pot feet, little rocks, giving you that air circulation and drainage is really important. I've had established lavender, thyme, oregano. It'll all last through the winter, especially if you can get it really established for years, or if you can give it a slight, if you can pull it closer to the house. So you're getting that protection from the house. That little bit of warmth will help, and just a little bit of protection. What will also help your herbs if you grow them in containers, which most of them will do fine, is if you put cut evergreens that you may want to decorate the container with. That adds as a little bit of insulation. So that could help as well.
Thank you. We had a question about pruning spent hydrangea flower heads. Would pruning those dried heads, does that increase future budding for your next growth period, or future more flowers?
It could it could affect your flowers with hydrangea arborescens. So you want to cut that down to the ground. I don't usually cut them down. I usually leave them, and I'll cut the dead stems out of there. I like to give them as much support as possible, and I don't find it really necessary to cut them down to the ground. Sometimes you can, and the blooms will get bigger by doing that. It just makes the stems a little bit weak. Sometimes hydrangea paniculata, they don't necessarily make the blooms larger. It's just it is a good thing to do for the plant to make them consistently bloom. And sometimes you've already come up with a framework, so keeping them the air circulation, keeping them nicely pruned is a good thing for the plant. So and I wouldn't prune them too hard. That's the thing. You need the support for the large flower heads.
Great. We have one last question, and this is in regards to a coral bark maple tree. The person mentions that it's gorgeous the first 5 years, but now it's older and it's taking over, and it doesn't have much color as the bark once did. Can it be pruned to help recover the vibrancy that it had?
It could, yeah, that could help. That would, I mean, rejuvenating any plant will help. Maybe I would plant something else that may be, you know, it may just be what the plant is doing. You know, it gets older. The same with Betula nigra. You know, maybe the plant gets too large for the space at that point, and it's time to pick a new plant. Sometimes rejuvenating just doesn't give, it will just take a really long time, is what I'm saying. If you cut the plant all the way down, it's not going to give you it also takes a long time for that plant to it may shoot up some new growth that may need some tending to. They may be really weak, the new growth. So if it's just something that you don't like anymore, I'd probably put in another plant of some kind.
That's the beauty of gardening.
It is, yeah. You have to have fun and, you know, experiment and try new things and, you know, just live with the seasons and the bugs in the winter and just experiment, really. Move it around.
Wonderful words. Thank you, Amy, for sharing your love of gardening with our members. This recorded presentation and the plant guide with the vendor list, as well as the websites, will be sent to all attendees. And I'd like to thank you, our members. Your support not only preserves our rich legacy, but also helps Longwood Gardens to continue to inspire for many generations to come. Thank you from all of us at Longwood.